April 1945. As Allied forces pushed deep into northern Germany, the fog of war began to thin, exposing horrors the world had never seen. Among them was Bergen-Belsen, a name that would soon become synonymous with human suffering. Yet within the ruins of the collapsing Reich, one story remained buried, a story that blurred the line between villain and victim. It began with a battalion that history nearly erased, a German unit that found itself in the heart of something it could neither comprehend nor justify. They were called the Bergen Battalion, and their commander, Oberleutnant Karl Radke, would soon face a decision that defied the logic of war. By early 1945, the German army was no longer the powerful machine that had conquered Europe. The Wehrmacht was shattered, its divisions broken, its soldiers starving, its morale gone. What remained were scattered fragments of units, desperate to survive another day in a war already lost. In Lower Saxony, a makeshift formation took shape from the remnants of retreating forces. It was led by Karl Radke, a career officer who had seen the brutality of the Eastern Front. He no longer believed in victory, only in staying alive long enough to protect the men under his command. His battalion was a patchwork of soldiers, veterans, teenagers from the Volkssturm, and men pulled from hospitals and supply depots, around 350 in total. They had few vehicles, little ammunition, and no illusions about their fate. Their orders were clear: delay the British advance toward Celle and Bergen no matter the cost. But by April 10th, it was obvious the war was over. The thunder of British artillery could be heard on the horizon, and the Luftwaffe no longer flew. Civilians fled eastward, terrified of the advancing Allies. Still, Radke's men held their positions in the forest near Wietze, clinging to discipline in a war that had already ended in spirit. It was then that reports reached Radke of something strange, not enemy tanks or paratroopers, but a camp several kilometers north of their sector. Local villagers whispered about it: endless barbed wire, watchtowers, and thousands of prisoners. Few knew what truly lay inside. None dared to go near. Radke sent a small reconnaissance patrol to verify the rumors. When they returned, pale and silent, their faces said everything. What they had seen defied comprehension: skeletal figures behind fences, mounds of bodies, guards abandoning their posts and fleeing into the woods. That camp was Bergen-Belsen. Radke could not believe it. Even after years on the Eastern Front, he had never seen such horror. The stench carried for kilometers. His men stood in silence as they approached the gates. The SS guards who remained were either dead, gone, or begging to surrender. For a moment there was no war and only disbelief. What happened next would never be officially recorded. Radke ordered his men to cease fire on all sides. He refused to engage the British forces approaching from the west. Instead, he sent a messenger under a white flag toward the British lines to warn them of what lay inside the camp. "There is no military objective here," he said. "Only death." When the British arrived on April 15th, they found the camp exactly as Radke described: over 60,000 prisoners, most near death. The German soldiers stood aside, unarmed. Some even helped carry stretchers and bury the dead under British supervision. Others broke down at the sight of the prisoners. No one knew what to call them: collaborators, deserters, or witnesses. For the British it was incomprehensible. German soldiers who had refused to fight, who had surrendered not out of fear but to reveal the truth of a horror hidden by their own government. When the war ended weeks later, most of Radke's men disappeared into the chaos of occupation. Some were taken prisoner, others went home under false names. Oberleutnant Radke himself was interrogated, then released. His actions deemed inconsistent with enemy conduct, but without criminal intent. He would live the rest of his life in silence, never speaking publicly about Bergen. But among the survivors of the camp, rumors persisted of German soldiers who stopped shooting, who handed over their weapons, and who chose humanity over orders. And in the ruins of the Reich, that choice, quiet, desperate, and unseen, may have been one of the last acts of mercy in a world consumed by cruelty. In the weeks that followed the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, the camp became the center of the world's attention, and one of the darkest revelations of the 20th century. Journalists, doctors, and Allied officers poured in, documenting what they could barely process. The images they captured, the heaps of bodies, the hollow eyes of survivors, would haunt humanity forever. But for those who had been there before the British, for the men of Radke's battalion, there was no place in the story. Their presence at the camp didn't fit the narrative that history wanted to tell. They were German soldiers, and Germany was the enemy. The idea that any of them might have acted with conscience was too complicated for a world that needed clarity. A British report dated April 17th mentioned briefly that a small German unit near the camp ceased resistance and cooperated with medical efforts. The report didn't name the commander, and in later versions of the document, that line disappeared altogether. Some witnesses, however, remembered. A British medical officer, Captain Derek Sington, later wrote in his diary, "There were German troops already on site, not SS. They appeared shocked, as if this was the first time they'd seen what their nation had done. One officer, calm but visibly shaken, told me, 'This is not war. This is something else entirely.' That officer was almost certainly Karl Radke. Radke's war ended not in defeat but in moral exhaustion. Interrogation records show that he was held for several months at a British facility in Celle. He answered all questions without hesitation, providing maps, reports, and names of fleeing SS officers. He asked for nothing in return, except one thing. He wanted the British to bury the dead properly. When questioned about why he didn't destroy the camp before the Allies arrived, as the SS had ordered, Radke replied simply, "Because enough had already been destroyed." After his release, he disappeared from official records. Some say he returned to Hanover and lived under a different name. Others claim he emigrated to Argentina in the early 1950s. No one knows for certain. What is known is that none of his men ever faced trial, nor did they speak publicly about what they saw. Their silence was their penance. For decades, historians debated whether the so-called Bergen Battalion truly existed. Some dismissed it as rumor, a comforting legend to suggest that not all Germans were complicit. But in 1986, during renovations near the outskirts of Bergen, construction workers unearthed a rusted ammunition crate. Inside were papers, water-damaged but legible. Among them, a fragment of a field log signed Oberleutnant K. Radke, 12th of April 1945. The entry read, "No longer a front, only ghosts. Men cannot fight in a place where God has turned his face away." Those few words, part confession, part eulogy, gave shape to a story long buried beneath the weight of history. The men of Radke's battalion didn't win battles or change the course of the war. But in its final, most senseless days, they made a choice that defied an empire built on obedience. They disobeyed. They chose to stop killing. They chose to surrender before being ordered to. And in doing so, they became something that the war itself could not fully destroy, human. The world may never know their names, but the legacy of that moment lives quietly in the testimony of those who survived. For among the chaos of Bergen-Belsen, there were soldiers who put down their rifles and helped carry the dying, not because they were heroes, but because they could no longer bear to be monsters. And that, perhaps, is the most fragile form of courage there is. Years after the war, the story of Bergen-Belsen was firmly etched in the world's collective memory, but only in part. The horror, the liberation, the photographs of emaciated survivors, these became the defining images of Nazi collapse. Yet in every retelling there was a silence where Radke's battalion should have been. For post-war Europe, the categories of good and evil had to remain clear. To suggest that German soldiers had acted with conscience, even in isolated moments, was uncomfortable. It blurred the boundaries that history had drawn to make sense of an unspeakable war. But truth, as history often shows, doesn't need permission to survive. It lingers, in diaries, in letters, in quiet recollections whispered decades later. One such recollection surfaced in 1978, when a woman named Ilse Rosenthal, a survivor of Bergen-Belsen, gave an interview for a BBC documentary. She was 17 in 1945, barely alive when British troops arrived. Near the end of her testimony, she mentioned something unusual. Before the English came, there were German soldiers here. They wore different uniforms from the SS. One of them gave my friend bread. He said, "Help is coming." "Hold on." I never saw him again. The interviewer moved on, perhaps assuming she was confused, but her words matched the timeline precisely. The different uniforms were Wehrmacht field grey, not SS black. Other survivors would later recount similar fragments. Soldiers who refused to shoot, who opened gates, who shouted to prisoners to stay inside because British forces were minutes away. None could give names, but the pattern was unmistakable. By the early 2000s, a small group of German historians began re-examining forgotten field reports from the Chell-Bergen sector. Among the scattered archives, they found references to a company under Radke that had ceased all hostia. An endless constellation of electricity stretching across the Texas plains at 10 at night. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification reached barely 20% of German farms. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda had described as a decadent, collapsed America, electricity flowed like water. 850 veterans of Erwin RML's Africa Corps stepped down from the passenger train. Not cattle cars, not freight wagons, but cushioned Pullman coaches with dining, services and sleeping bees. The entire population of Mexia had turned out to witness their arrival. What none of them knew was that this moment would trigger the most profound psychological transformation in modern history. A systematic demolition of Nazi ideology through the sheer display of American industrial capacity. The mathematics of Allied victory were being written not in battle plans, but in production statistics that would soon shatter every assumption these soldiers carried about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. The collapse had begun on May 13, 1943 in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, surrendered along with approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The numbers varied as scattered units continued surrendering over several days. The Wehrmacht's most experienced desert fighters, men who had driven the British back to Egypt, who had earned the grudging respect of Montgomery himself, were suddenly prisoners. Among them was Headman Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, veteran of the France campaign, wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later in the National Archives, would provide historians with the most detailed account of the psychological impact of American captivity on German soldiers. The journey from defeat to revelation began in the port of Aruran, Algeria, as Radke and 30,000 other PS waited in makeshift camps for transport ships. American efficiency was already beginning to crack their preconceptions. The U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners daily with an organizational precision that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved even at the height of its power. Identity cards photographed and filed, medical examinations completed, inoculations administered, Geneva Convention rights explained in fluent German by American officers who had been trained specifically for this moment. But the first real shock came with the food. Oberreiter Hans Mühr, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later. In the cage at Aruran, while we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, that they were trying to impress us. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration. The Liberty ships that would carry them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to American industrial capacity. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California. A fact that would have been dismissed as impossible propaganda if the Germans had known it. These vessels, produced at a rate of 3 per day at the peak of production, were returning from delivering supplies to the European theater. Rather than sail back empty, they carried human cargo up to 30,000 PSWs per month by summer 1943. The 2-week Atlantic crossing in July 1943 provided the second phase of psychological demolition. Feldkurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a detailed account that survived in letters to his family after repatriation. The ship's crew, he noted, disposed of more food waste each day than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months in Africa. The American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long, Zimmermann wrote. They did this openly, without thought, not to mock us, but because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. The ships themselves became floating classrooms in American power. Pierce discovered that the vessel carrying them was one of 2,510 Liberty ships that would be built during the war. each one requiring 250,000 parts assembled from components manufactured in 32 states. The engines, they learned from talkative American guards, were built in 3 separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders that were then assembled in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stauburn, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs, "As our ship approached the American coast, I watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. This technology, which we believed only we and perhaps the British possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel. It was then I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war." August 2, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia, the first sight of America, shattered the last remnants of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The Norfolk base sprawled across 4,300 acres, its docks stretching for miles, its cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships simultaneously. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. Gerrit Jon Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading. Each crane, he noted in his secret diary, lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany. They moved with electric power, smoothly, continuously, without the coal smoke that choked our industrial cities. The prisoners were formed into columns for the march to the waiting trains. Along the route, they passed parking lots filled with civilian automobiles, hundreds of them belonging to dock workers. In Germany, private automobile ownership remained a privilege of the wealthy and the party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to the German people since 1934, remained a propaganda dream with fewer than 1,000 ever delivered to civilians. Here, ordinary laborers drove to work in their own cars. But nothing prepared them for the trains themselves. Not boxcars, not the 40 and 8 wagons, 40 men or 8 horses that had carried German troops across Europe, but full passenger coaches, Pullman cars with padded seats that converted to sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. Hedman Radke wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." The American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly in our car. Air conditioning. In August, we had believed such luxury existed only in Hitler's personal train. The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat. As the trains rolled through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that couldn't exist according to everything they had been told. Every small town blazed with illumination. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, communities that in Germany would have been lucky to have a single electric street lamp, displayed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing, parking lots full even at midnight. Obergreiter Mayer, whose father was a Nazi party block leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered in 1987, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Everyone had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said we would see." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched as American railway workers performed in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems. Every aspect of the operation demonstrated technological superiority. More disturbing still was the casual wealth of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empties into bins without thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finished. Failed Webel Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Siemens before the war, calculated that the single railway yard they stopped in used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. They left lights burning in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. As the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners encountered American industrial power in full display. Through the windows, they watched endless factories, each one larger than anything most had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 mi along the river, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the train slowed as they passed the Rubber Town complex, where synthetic rubber plants had sprung from empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, understood the implications immediately. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built, and there were 4 of them just in this one location. They told us there were dozens more across the country. The trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles away. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 parts, manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant consumed 2.5 million square feet of floor space and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hartmann Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion, visible from the train. We had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, would fall apart in combat, but I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could imagine possible. The deeper the trains penetrated into America, the more complete became the destruction of Nazi mythology. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge, while below them, barges carried more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. The prisoners could see grain elevators stretching along both banks, each one holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unreicher Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition in endless quantities without concern for loss. I watched them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped at a massive stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The smell of meatpacking plants filled the air for miles. German PS, who had subsisted on 200 dri of meat per week in Africa, when Lucky watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during their lunch break. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote griefer Paul Fischer. No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wished we could eat bread. The guard bought us hamburgers from a stand near the station. Meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for 15. He bought 20 of them without thinking, paid with a single dollar bill. This was not special. This was their normal food. The arrival at the camps themselves provided the next level of cognitive demolition. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners, in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Each building constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital astounded the medical personnel among the prisoners. Oberst Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941, all standard provision for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer would later testify, this miracle drug that we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs, and the Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchen became another classroom in American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges that could prepare meals for 5,000 men. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, quantities that German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote, "Today, we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. The American regulations require we prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner receives full rations. The surplus is discarded." I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage. By September 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture led to the employment of POWs in fields and factories across the country. This decision, driven by necessity, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have achieved. Groups of prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through the American heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything: the endless fields of corn and wheat, the factories running 3 shifts, the shops full of goods, the parking lots full of cars, the houses with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unreizier Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have handled in a month using traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, Lang recorded. Not aristocracy, not a party member, just a farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including the Negroes, ate lunch from boxes containing more food than German workers received in a week.